Okay, so welcome to world building class. This is the third iteration of the class, and first I want to talk about the general curriculum, what we will talk about in the class in general. I want to give an overview of. Let me just start this. I want to give an overview of what we will go through in the upcoming 14 weeks, and then slowly start it up. And today's lecture will not be a very long one. I didn't actually plan how long. We'll just start and see. So let's go. Let me start sharing my screen. And as a rather old person, again, I have to find the button. Seriously, I knew where it was. Ah, here it is, the big green one. So it is this one. Okay. You can all see the screen, right?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Let me just turn this out. Okay. So world building, the 101 part is just a little joke, but it's world building 101. So we are in week 1 right now, and we are going to go into the basics. But first, I want to go over what we will go over. So the first week is the introduction. This is where we are right now. And next week, we will go into the basics of the universe. In this, we are going to cover, for example, the physics, laws of physics in the universe, things that we take for granted, but might be different for certain reasons, especially since we are talking about video games. These basics of the universe or the laws of physics may be bent or broken in certain situations. Just as a small example, you might need a game where you can change gravity. We're basically putting it. So we're going to talk about the basics of the universe, our game universe, and what it means to us. And the week after that is actually the week that is very fun. Generally, we are going to talk about maps, how to create maps for our world, and what to look for in a map, what to take into consideration when creating a map. Then, as you can see from this list, we will slowly progress to the more complex elements. And I don't mean to say that, for example, the topology is not complex enough, but as you will see in a few slides later, there are certain things that we want to do in a world. And when you think about that, this kind of progression will give us a better layered structure into our world. So next week, the week after maps, we will look into flora and fauna. This means the plants and animals, flora meaning the general plant population, and fauna being the general animal population of a world. And as you can guess, flora and fauna don't necessarily need to be two separate things. But in our world, it is classified as such. So the naming is also classified as such. We're going to look into plants. We're going to look into animals, how we can design a different creature, how we can design different plants, whether we need to design different creatures and plants or not. We're going to look into that. And after looking into this, the following week, we will go into intelligent species, because without intelligent species, a world would be pretty boring. I mean, even if you are designing a world that will be visited for the first time, you will need a species to visit it. It can be even humans, but as you very well know, even the term human can be divided into subcategories in form of races or humanoid races, let's say, as in different RPG games or in sci-fi games. And then will come the part that we will see about real world building. And by real, I mean the cultures, because whenever you dive into a world in a game or in any other medium, whether a world is believable or not comes down to two things. Actually, the first part is this first part that we see here. Is the world believable in a physical sense? And we will go into this with very much detail, and then is the world believable in a cultural sense? Because there are things that we know from ourselves, from our lives, from our culture and the cultures around the world. And we need our world to be believable, to be plausible. So the audience should say, yes, such a world can exist. So we will go into culture, and then we will go into communication and languages. And that will not be enough for me, because I am a very enthusiastic conlang enthusiast, let's say. So conlang means constructed languages, and I guess you actually know quite a lot of constructed languages by name. You know, there are Klingon, and well, the most well-known one is Klingon, actually, in Star Trek. But for example, recently with Game of Thrones, we were introduced to a number of conlangs as well. And Tolkien, of course, is the master and the most famous conlanger, but he's not the first one, as we will see. There are others coming before him, almost 200 years before him. There were conlangs being created all over the world. And then we will go into art. And although it's a very subjective subject, let me see, just let me take the chat over here. Okay, but by the way, you can write whatever you want in the chat. You can just comment on it however you like. We will go into art, how art influences the culture that we create, or the cultures, multiple cultures that we create. Then we will go into government styles and economic systems, because these generally go hand in hand with each other. I mean, a government style defines an economic system, or vice versa, or they both depend on something else. Then we will go into belief systems, and this will be a very fun lesson, I believe, because we will go into pantheons, gods, and mythologies, and creation myths. It's always a lot of fun to see them, how they are created, how they are developed, how they affect their cultures. And then we will go into the history of the world. So how to create a consistent history for our world, because that will be important for us when we lay our world into our game. Then we will go a little bit into special effects. I call this special effects because it's kind of from a movie jargon. Anything that you have to do with SFX, as in, is called special effects. So in this case, it means science and magic, because you see, before CGI, these things were called practical effects. Special effects were practical effects in movies. But again, in our world, when we define at the very first, when we the things that we define the basics of the universe, we will define some physical laws of physics, and other laws. Maybe they might be not only physical laws, but they might be divine laws, for example, if we are talking about gods and creation. So we will talk about some laws. Then in special effects, we will specifically talk about how to break them, because there will come instances that we will need to break them. Especially, again, talking about game design, we will need to introduce special mechanics. For example, the world will have some rules, and we will have some mechanics. We will design certain things to break those rules. So these are all, for us, special effects, science and magic. And this is together with today, it is 13 weeks, but we have 14 weeks in the whole semester. I left 1 week because there might be a problem that we may not be able to do the lesson. So I don't want to get left behind. But if nothing goes wrong, and if we do all these lessons in order, I want to set the final week apart for some bonus content. For example, maybe something totally about games, or maybe about talking about your project, something like that. We can decide about that on the run. So let me just allow me to open something else here, something I forgot about. If you give me a second. By the way, I will put these, I will share these lecture notes, slides, actually, so you can download them and get the bullet points yourself. So, okay. Is there anything you want to say about the curriculum? Anything you want to add, or any comments you have? Okay, Aslı says the curriculum seems just so fun, and thank you. That is, there are so many things to talk about. Actually, this can be an entire 4-year program, if you ask me. But we are going to go. We will just touch the bullet points here. So, because I don't plan to make each lecture 3 hours long. By the way, I am more aiming for a 2-hour period, because honestly, 3 hours is tiring for everyone, not just for me, but it's also tiring for you. Well, Batıkan asks, is it like a creative writing course? No, actually not, because creative writing, well, creative writing involves a lot of narrative and storytelling. And even though we will go into that, and maybe the last lesson that I'm saving may be about storytelling and hero's journey. I have another lesson about that. Our main emphasis is about creating the world itself. Because, well, I will go into that. Actually, if you can wait a little bit, if a few more slides, I will go into it. But this is not basically a creative writing course. We are going to write things, but it won't be creative in the sense of a story. So, okay, these are the bullet points of the lessons that you will see. So, introduction. Okay. When we talk about world building, why do we create worlds? We create worlds to protect home and family, to preserve balance and bring harmony. For our kind, the question is, what is world building for? Okay, does anyone know where this is from? Nobody? Okay. Okay, I'm old. This is from the Mists of Pandaria expansion cinematic of World of Warcraft. I actually love this quote, so I just shoehorned it in here. I'm sorry. And the guy just looks so cool. So now for the more serious tone, why do we create worlds? Now there are two main reasons that we create worlds. We can count lots of reasons if you think about it, but it all boils down to 2 reasons. And the first one is not the one that we are interested in. The first reason is for ourselves. So we want to dream about a world, and we want to think about, and we want to create a world. But for what? For ourselves. This in and on itself is not a reason. It is a reason, sorry, but it is not the reason we are looking for. The reason we are looking for is we want to use the world somewhere. So to make this distinction is important, because there is something like called the, well, designer's dilemma. And it's actually more like a black hole, where you start designing something and then you just start building it. And then you forget about everything else and you focus on building the world. And then about 10 years later, you have a fully realized world in your hands, but nothing to do with it. So, and this can go for a lifetime actually, but we want to use our world somewhere. So it can be a story that we want to tell someone, or it can be a book that we are considering writing. It can be for an RPG campaign that we are brewing ourselves to play with our friends. So something we want to game master as. It can be for a movie. You might be willing to, you might want to write a movie script and you need a world for it. Or in our case, it might be for a video game. So these are just the main ways that I could think of. You can think of it for a theater play, or you can think of it for something else. But a story, a novel or a novella, an RPG campaign, a movie, a video game, all these things are the reasons that we might be willing to put in the effort to create this world. We want to use the world for something. And there is a common point in all these 5 examples I gave you. There's a common point. Do you have any idea what that might be? What is the common point for these storybook, RPG campaign, movie, video game reasons to create and use a world? What might be the thing that brings them together? Engage people. Very good. Yes, we want to engage people, and that is the indirect answer that I'm looking for. Actually, this is the response that we are looking for. What are we trying to do with it? Is we want to tell a story. So there's something in our mind, a story that we want to convey, and in return we want to engage people. That is also correct. The story itself is the thing that actually creates the world. So again, each event is preceded by prophecy, but without the hero, there is no event. Do you know which game this is from? These are like small pop quizzes for people over 30 years old or 35 years old. This is from Morrowind, Elder Scrolls 3, and this is again a quote I love so much that I just put it in here. So without a story, there is no world. You can, again, as I said, create a world only for yourself without ever a story that takes place in it. But that is not the point of creating a world, as I just tried to tell you. We want to tell a story. So, and this story that we create in our minds will slowly start to shape the world. Or it might be the other way around. So there are 2 ways to tell this story and the world that we are building. We might start building the world and hope a story will come out of it. But again, as I said, it's not for the sake of world building itself. There is a story that you need to tell, even if it's for a game or a book. You might start creating the world, creating the conflicts, and then hope a story will come out. And if you create enough conflicts, a story will come out, definitely. Or you can have the story and you might start building the world around it, because certain points in your story, and this is where we dip into the creative writing part, actually. When you start writing the story, you will need certain points to advance the story. You will need certain hooks to engage the audience, the player or the viewer. And those hooks will start building the world for you. And where this course will help you is to see how you can effectively use those hooks to create worlds. Because, for example, if you are talking about 2 races that are enemies of each other, and you need to base this off to something, because a dialogue that you want to write requires it. A dialogue between an elf and a dwarf may refer to an old war between the races, and this can be your history of the world. This can become a part of the history of your world. And now you're world building. What we aim to do is to do this consistently. And that is what I hope you will take away from this course. So we want to build a world. Okay. We want to build, as I said, we want to write our story and build our world, or the other way around. We want to build our world first and hope a story will come out of it. So the first thing we will do, actually, when starting to design our world, is the same thing that we do when we design anything else. So if you have any experience in design, it can be web design, industrial design, anything, you follow the same basic steps. There might, your particular discipline may have some set strict rules about it. I cannot know about that, but there is a general thing in it. So what we first go into is the concept stage, because even if the world pops up in our mind when we wake up one day, maybe we saw it in a dream or it comes to us in the shower, it doesn't matter. There will be a concept in our head first from something you see across the street maybe. So the first thing we will have is a concept about our world. What will this world be like? And during the course, I will many times talk about games because this is a game design course basically. So, and in a game, this concept stage is very important because it will set the tone for your game and it will set the tone for your audience. That is the most important part because you are creating this for an audience, for a gaming audience. And the gaming audience will have some expectations and reservations about anything they see. It's not like approaching a book because gaming, as you may well know, requires some sort of literacy, gaming literacy. It's just like it's like gamers knowing that pressing space is going to make them jump. It's that expectation, right? So any game, for example, that you cannot jump may not give the same sense of freedom, even though the jump may be totally useless in that game. For example, I remember SWAT 3 or 4, one of the SWAT games that I used to play as a child didn't have jump mechanic, and it didn't need one jump mechanic because you are playing a tactical police officer and you are going around places. You don't need to jump to place from one ledge to another. But even then, not having the jump was a little off-putting, for example. It's an expectation that the gamers have. So coming back to the point, we have a concept stage and we have a theme. And this theme is very important. For example, you see these three, well, two of them are computer games. One of them is an RPG world. Do you know which ones they are? Of course you do. Maybe not the top right one. The left one is pretty obvious. And the bottom one is, I think, pretty obvious too. I hope so. It's one of my favorite worlds. The left one is the world of Fallout. And the bottom one is the world of Mad Max. And the right one is the world of Dark Sun. It's an RPG campaign. It has computer games, but the computer games were made in the 90s and they are awesome. So for example, these are three completely different games. If you think about video game terms, they have completely different mechanics. They have completely different play styles. The Fallout games are first person. Mad Max game is not games, it's a game. Game is third person, and Dark Sun games are top down party games. But can you, if you you may not know Dark Sun, but you know, I think, Fallout and Mad Max pretty well. So what do you think is the common theme between all these three settings, these three worlds? Do you have any ideas about that? Any takers?
Fallout and Mad Max are post-apocalyptic.
And
I don't know what Dark Sun.
Okay, so I will, if you allow me, I will just change something. Okay, I won't change something. Yes, they are post-apocalyptic, and Dark Sun is actually also post-apocalyptic. It's an RPG setting. Now you can see how vastly different they are in their style, right? But the central theme is the same. Some catastrophe has occurred in the world, and the creatures that live on, I say creatures because Fallout and Mad Max take place in our world, while Dark Sun is in a fantasy setting, in a completely different planet and plane, actually. But it's about a catastrophe and what people do afterwards. So the theme in all three games or worlds is post-apocalypse. And it's one of my favorite themes, to be frank. So I put these up here. But the way all three approach this is very, very different from each other. Not just in the term of game mechanics, because they are, as I said, very different games with very different rules. But the way that they handle the theme is also very different, because Fallout is mainly about how people try to rebuild after an apocalypse. So it's about rebuilding in a post-apocalyptic scenario. I mean, you may not agree, but the player's adventure may not be about rebuilding, but the world itself is, in Fallout, is a world that tries to heal, that tries to build the civilization again in some way or form. So there's New Californian Republic and other government structures slowly forming around. There are institutions that are trying to rebuild things. Now in Mad Max, post-apocalypse is about how humanity falls after an apocalypse. So there are, in Mad Max, there are structures that humans gather around, not literal structures, not buildings, but there are societies forming around, but they are not in the rebuilding sense. They are more like savage, tribal structures, and they are not about, the setting itself is not about how to rebuild humanity. It's about how humanity falls when you keep the intelligence, but you remove all the structure that keeps that intact. So the people in Mad Max are savage, and it's an evil world where death is very common. But this is shown in a way, in a brutal way, that you see how people react when you remove all, for example, police force or government. That is a take on the world. It doesn't say it is going to be that way. For example, it is similar in Kevin Costner's Postman, another post-apocalyptic movie. But in Dark Sun, for example, it is about how control is established after an apocalypse, because Dark Sun is a very different world. It has magic in it, and it has psionics in it. For example, some meta knowledge, psionics is in Dark Sun because at the time psionics is also something that was introduced in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and probably they needed a world to test, to use that psionic classes in, and such. In Dark Sun, magic is banned. It is seen as evil because it is the cause of the apocalypse that happened in the world. But in Dark Sun, the savagery of Mad Max remains there. But on top of it, there is a very strict control scheme placed by overpowered beings. So there are OP wizards in the game, and they control cities, and they impose laws. So in that sense, Dark Sun takes a different approach and uses the city-state system from our world's history, and we will come to that in following lectures. So what I'm trying to say in general is the theme post-apocalypse means a lot of different things to us. And the way we approach makes one post-apocalyptic world very different to another one. So I hope I'm making the point here. So in this, in the theme, we go into genre because, and this is again about the world. This is not about gameplay style genre. So we are not talking about roguelikes, or we are not talking about first-person shooters or RPG games. In genre, we mean the world's genre. So for example, post-apocalypse, or we can call something about steampunk, or we can talk about post-apocalypse steampunk, meaning, for example, Frostpunk is a good example of this. Or we can go into cyberpunk, which is a cross between steampunk and science fiction, and maybe not actually so. Or we can go into fantasy, and we can go into high fantasy or low fantasy. Do you know the difference between high fantasy and low fantasy? Just a question. Does anyone know how we name them? So high fantasy is the kind of fantasy where magic and magical creatures are very common. They may be even accepted in daily life. And low fantasy is where they are found scarcely. So for example, Game of Thrones is a low fantasy setting because most of its world mechanics, not in game mechanics, but the way the world works is based on real world, and magic, even though magic does play a part, you don't see magic casters in the street. But a typical D&D world is high fantasy because you can see mages everywhere. There are magical creatures around the corner. For example, the world of Witcher, in this case, looks like low fantasy because magic is not really accessible. But I think it's actually something between low and high, near high fantasy, because you can have monsters anywhere. I mean, they are not special creatures that come out at certain parts of the world. They are a part of the world, so much so that you need professional monster hunters called witchers to hunt those monsters. So it is more like high fantasy. But as I said, these are not set in stone. So you can mix and match. You can create a fantasy world that is post-apocalyptic, or you can, as in Dark Sun, or you can create a space opera or hard. Yes, there's space opera and hard sci-fi. For example, hard sci-fi is the kind of sci-fi world that tries to depend on science as much as possible. So it is something more like Star Trek, where you try to base your scientific things on actual science. Of course, that is not fully possible because there is a part of science that prevents us doing these science fiction things. We don't have warp drive yet, and we don't actually know how it will work if it works. So any science fiction, even if it's hard sci-fi, it is not plausible in today's world. And that brings us to creating a believable world. But for example, space opera is more like guns in space. So you can put Star Wars more to space opera side of things, because even though Star Wars explains everything in details in manuals, the movies themselves don't create these explanations for you. There are magical lightsabers, light swords, laser swords that you can wave around, and you can create planet exploding lasers, but it doesn't give the background of that in the world itself. So for us, as I'm not taking any sides, by the way, in the Star Trek or Star Wars thing, I don't think one is better than the other. They are two different parts of the spectrum, and they have two different audiences. And in certain cases, like me, I like both of them. So, but now after the theme, we will come to something different. And when we combine the theme with the mood, we start to flesh out our world, actually, because after we set the theme, set a genre, and then we set the mood, we start to see how our audience will see the world. Does that make sense? Because when they come into contact with our game, with our world, they will not immediately see the world building. They will see the colors that we choose, the palette that we create. And this is very important in games, actually, the color palette of the game, in both game design and in this case in world design, because the theme that we choose and the mood that we set it in will change things drastically. For example, by mood, by the way, I don't mean only colors, because for example, Dark Sun is a world where hope is very scarce. I mean, people who hope are seen as fools because there is no hope left in the world. It is that kind of a mood. But for example, in World of Warcraft, you don't see it that way. There is evil in the world, but you always, as any side that you take, you try to create something better for your side. Well, I don't want to give World of Warcraft as a specific example, but you can see how mood affects. For example, as I said, again, in Fallout, you have a lighter mood. Well, especially at least in Fallout 3 and 4, you have a lighter mood. Fallout 1 and 2 didn't have a light mood at all. It's actually pretty dark if you played the games. Fallout 1 and 2 is about atomic horror, and Fallout 3 and 4 is about how cool you can be in post-apocalyptic world. It's about, well, you might have realized that I am more of a fan of Fallout 1 and 2. But for example, in Mad Max, especially if you follow through the storyline of the game, you see that the mood is pretty bleak. I mean, especially we see that from Mad Max, Max's own psychological state, and the things that take place in the game, the things that Max founds or learns or lives through. And Dark Sun is not just a single game, it's an entire RPG campaign. So the mood there is more or like, what the hell happened to this world? Because there's a mystery in Dark Sun that you don't know how the world came to a state like this. You don't know why it is like this. And in a good Dark Sun campaign, you tap into that. You start to see what made the world this way. And you might even have an epic go at trying to stop it from happening. And you would fail. Because, for example, Dark Sun players, Dark Sun rulebook says, have your players create 3 characters so that if one dies and when one dies, another one can step in. So your players won't be bored at the table. You can introduce new characters because your characters will die. So we set the mood. And now when we go into the design side of things, what we do is create mood boards. And I'm sure those of you design inclined people know about this already. A mood board is the things that you passed together to get a feel of the mood that you want to create. So these are random mood boards I collected from the internet. So they are not game related, but you can see this one is more furniture related, maybe about home design. I don't know. This one is more yellow related, let's say, but it's about maybe holidays or maybe about a website, that a holiday vacation website that you want to create. And this one's clearly about England. This one is about maybe old times or maybe vintage things. I don't know. But if we create such a mood board for our game, we can be, or for our world and consequently our game, we can get quite a lot of information out of it actually. So I'm going to give you a mood board here and try ask you to think about what kind of a world this is. So some of these images, of course, you know from popular culture. And there's a guy here that is willing to play every single role in gaming history, but that's okay. So what kind of a world do you think this is? In terms of setting or genre or
Fantasy.
mood? Yeah, it is a high fantasy world because, for example, we see this is a draconian from the Dragonlance series. So, and it's a magic wielding, and there's another obviously mage here. So this is a high fantasy world with knights in it, apparently, and naval battles, because apparently sea plays an important role here. And there are very developed cities. So there is a high degree of civilization, and there are dragons, so magical creatures, okay. And there are very different cities as well. But in general, you can see that this board gives me an idea of what I'm going to work with as a designer. So if I create this mood board and send this to you, for example, and you are the world builder, and I am also a world builder, for example, and I say, hey, this is what I have in mind. And when you look at this, you can actually guess what I'm thinking about, right? So this world might include very epic battles between armies and magic users leading or helping those armies, and maybe naval battles and magical creatures also aiding. So this, for example, sets a different tone than each individual picture here, but it creates a collective whole. Right? Does this make any sense? Okay. So what I want to show you next is the sources that where you can create mood boards. MS Paint is just a small joke there, but you can use MS Paint, no problem. Canva is a good place to create mood boards, and also Turbo Collage is also another website I found about that, and there are other sources as well. You can use your own. But for this week, for example, I will ask you to create a mood board for a world. It doesn't have to be the world that you will work in your project. So you don't have to stress out from the very beginning. I don't know what I want to create. Just think about something. Maybe think about a world that you like very much from a game or from a book, and go in that direction. Try to iterate on that. Try to create a new world out of that. Maybe add some different elements as I've shown here. Maybe take a world that you like and think about something different about that. For example, what if the world of Fallout was not in the 50s aesthetic, post-atomic era, but it was a, I don't know, steampunk post-apocalyptic world? How different would it be from Frostpunk? Or the Snowpiercer, which I found very, frankly, a very implausible idea, a train moving around the world because it's cold. I mean, it's a little far-fetched, but okay. So try to create a mood board. And as I said, you can always ask me questions about what you want to create. Take a world that you like, or mash up two worlds that you like, or take a world that you don't like, or try to turn something that you like, whatever. So for this week's assignment, I'm going to ask you to create a mood board for a world. Not necessarily your project world, for any world that you would like to exercise about. So, and then if you want, we can take a small break. We don't have much left, but if you're tired, you can take a 5-minute break because it's been around 1 hour already. Is everyone okay with that? Nobody's okay with that. Okay. Then we continue. We will talk about what a world is, because again, we come to a crossroads about this. Now, we have actually two kinds of worlds in our hands when we try to create a world. And this is the world that we see and the world that we know. And by we, I mean the audience. The world the audience sees versus the world that the audience knows. So in game terms, this is the world as a background and the world as the play area. So what do I mean by that? Now, in a game, we are specifically talking about games now, because in books or RPG campaigns, this is a very much gray area. But in games, there is a play area that we create for the players to play in. And this area can be procedurally generated or handcrafted. It doesn't matter that much, because there will be limits to this play area unless you are creating Minecraft, and that's a different thing entirely. But even then, Minecraft has a play area about 8 times the surface of Earth. But when you come to the ends of it, you start to get problems because of limitations of computer programming. But Minecraft is not a good example for this, because Minecraft is just a terrain. It isn't a world that, in the sense that we want to create. So if you return to the topic, when we create a game and we create a world for it, we create a world with boundaries. In an open world game, naturally, these boundaries are very large. We can create a very big playing area. In a linear game, this play area will be, of course, more limited. Now, And then this play area will be the area that the player will interact with. This area will carry the immediate elements of our world that we create. The player will interact with these elements, and the player will experience Can you hear me properly?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good, because Zoom just warned me that my microphone is not detected, so I was worried there for a moment. Okay, so in opposed to the, or complementing the world as the play area, there is the world as a background. And I think you understood where I'm going with this. This is the world that we will create as part of our lore for the part that will be the play area. A very good example for this is the stories that NPCs tell about other parts of the world, or the books that you find inside the world about other parts of the world. This is the general tapestry that will create the world, but the player will never encounter. So it is also important for us to distinguish between these two worlds, because one of them will naturally require more effort than the other, and you can guess which one is which. So to give a very good example of this, we have the Elder Scroll games. Well, this is the Tamriel map, and as you probably all very well know, Tamriel is the continent that Elder Scrolls games take place in. And you know Hyrule, Hammerfell, Skyrim. Skyrim is the most famous one, probably. Runderfeld, a less famous one. Cyrodiil is the one that I never visited, but I plan to change that soon enough. And Black Marsh. And of course, recently the Elder Scrolls Online made this all playable. But before Elder Scrolls Online, there was Elder Scrolls Arena. This is the first game of the series. I haven't played it. I was too young to play it when it came out. And that makes it very, very old. But let's say it hasn't aged very well, so it isn't very easy to play these days. But in Arena, you could go anywhere in the world in Tamriel. Of course, it wasn't detailed, because I don't know if you know the history of Elder Scrolls, but it's actually started as a gladiator game where you had a team of gladiators and you would go around the world and fight in arenas, hence the name, and try to gain fame. And then slowly, as they started to build the world and started to add story in it, it became a role-playing game. It evolved from an arena game, gladiatorial game, to a role-playing game. And even though we will talk about this in the next lecture, but even though the play area was very large, the detail was not that high. And then came the second game, Daggerfall. Daggerfall takes place in, can you see my mouse cursor, by the way?
Yes.
Okay, great. Daggerfall takes place in this area between High Rock and Hammerfell, as you can see here. And it is a very large area. I mean, it is still one of the biggest game maps that you can ever see. Again, at the cost of detail, because it's a 2D game. By the way, Daggerfall is a wonderful game. It's one of my favorite games in the series still, and it's recently got a Unity remake from some fans, and it plays great. Doesn't need DOSBox. You just need to get the Daggerfall files. The original files are free. I will put them online for you, the website online for you. But the thing is, it is just this part of the world. Now, if you started the series with Daggerfall, you know about these parts, but you don't ever see these parts. It is not possible to go these parts, but you know about elves. You see elves in this world, but elves, dark elves or high elves or wood elves are not natives of this area. So you can see red guards who are natives to Hammerfell, and you see them here. They are basically the black people in Skyrim. And you see Hyrak and Bretons here. Okay, very well. The other races you encounter in this world, but they are not native to here. So this is part of the lore when you talk about them and you learn about their homeland. And then the third game, Morrowind, takes place here, the island of Runderfeld. So this is Morrowind, the province of Morrowind, but the game takes place in this island. And this is very convenient because in Daggerfall, the world was so large that you didn't go to this place, or you didn't go here, or you didn't go here because it was very inconvenient. Actually, there is a YouTube video that tries to go from this corner of the map to this corner of the map, and it takes 76 real-time hours to ride a horse from here to here. Now consider that to Skyrim, where you can scale the map in 5 minutes, and you see what kind of a big world I'm talking about. So in Morrowind, this was very convenient because the world was in 3D and it was scaled down considerably. So it took place here in an island, and you couldn't go outside the island. But Morrowind is home to dark elves, Dunmer, as in the world. So whatever other race that you encounter inside this island came from outside, and they are part of the lore of the game, because there are other races here, of course, and you can play another race too. And the fourth game, Oblivion, the one that I haven't played, takes place in the Imperial province, Cyrodiil. You can see from the shape. It is again 3D and thus a scaled down version. You can go from one end to the other quite quickly, but that is the cost that you have to pay if you want to make a handcrafted continent. And again, you play in the Imperial province, and the most famous one, Skyrim, maybe probably the biggest map of them all, but still quite small, considering Daggerfall. You play in the Skyrim region. And in the main thing is, the Elder Scrolls games, even from the very beginning, have lots and lots of books to read from. And all these books create a world around you that is not part of the main world. So, for example, in Skyrim, you can find books that will give you information about real places in the game world and will even give you quests. But those books are very little in number, maybe 4 or 5 books like that. But the other 200 or so books give you information about the world. They are giving you knowledge about this other outside world that you cannot see in the game. So we have two kinds of worlds in our hands. The world as a play area, the world that the audience will experience firsthand, and the world that the audience will know about, but not experience. And this will bring us to the point of expending our energy to certain one of these. Okay, so is there anything you want to add or ask about all this stuff? Okay, then moving on. So we are nearing the end, so it will be just about maybe 1 hour today, but that is by choice because I didn't want to start by a 3-hour lecture. Next week it will be probably 2 hours, but today it's going to be a little short. We have some design choices to make when building a world, and this is actually quite straightforward, and I think you will understand what I mean immediately when you see them. We can design top to bottom, we can design bottom to top, or we can design in the middle to both sides. So what does this mean? Designing from top to bottom means we first lay out the very basics of the world. We will start next week with laying the very basics of the world. And we go down from there. We go into details after fleshing out the generals. So the physics of the world, the cosmology, the topology, the flora, fauna, and all that stuff, going down into intricate details. Or we can choose to design from bottom to top. And this is top to bottom is something we more create when we want to create the world first, then create the story inside it. But we more lean towards bottom to top when we first want to create the story, and then from that story we want to create the world. Because, for example, you might have a magical substance that prolongs human life and give magical powers of insight, and then you start to design a world around it. For example, this is kind of what Dune is about, Frank Herbert's Dune, because spice is such a central theme in the world that you can see it's almost about bottom to top design. Because if there was such a substance in the world that did this and this and this, how would the world change about it? How would the world form around it? And there are generally pitfalls about going to this design, bottom to top. You will see about it, especially in magic, designing magic. But bottom to top design can create some unwanted pyramid where everything depends on that single little detail that you want to emphasize. But we know from our world that there are very, but nothing ever depends on only one single thing. So the more balanced approach is middle to both sides. So we have an idea about a general concept that we want to introduce, and we think about designing to both sides of it. So this is not a strict approach. You don't choose either top to bottom or bottom to top. You generally start something in the middle, somewhere in the middle. Okay, so this is what we are going to employ in our future lessons. We are going to start in the middle, and we will go whichever direction we want to go to. But these are the general directions that we can take in designing. So, and the final thing that I want to include here, because it doesn't actually belong anywhere else deeper into the course, is naming things. Because naming things is a general struggle that we will have about everything in our world. So it doesn't belong to governments, or it doesn't belong to races, or it doesn't belong to other things. And naming is actually, as I will just tell you, is quite a meta thing. It's not about the world itself all the time. It's about the audience. So you can name for the sake of the world. You can just think about the world, and you can think what this thing, this place, this concept, this person would be named. And this is more or less what Tolkien did actually. But what Tolkien did wisely was to translate it to English. So you can see in Tolkien's works, especially the Lord of the Rings, is that he says he translated them from the books that elves wrote. So he actually sees himself as a translator from Elvish to English. So actually the names that he has are in Elvish, but he finds English names for them. So you can do a similar thing and name for the sake of the world, or you can name for the audience. And in gaming, this is the more prominent approach, because the audience need to be able to pronounce the things when talking to one another. That's how games spread. And the name should be memorable so that they can remember the name of the NPC or the place that they were going to revisit. Of course, they can always check the journal if you put one in, but making these things memorable is what makes things stick in people's minds. So how are names given in the real world? For example, a name can be a physical property of the region, as you see here, Yeditepe, or it can be a name regarding the significance of the area. So if there is a monolith somewhere, that place can be called Dikilitaş, for example. Or it can be a person that has an importance about that place, or the owner of the land, something like Koca Mustafa Pasha. I left the names in Turkish in purpose because I know it will connect better to us. But this is the last thing that I want to talk about this week, because this is something that we will think about quite a lot when we are creating our world. We will think about how to name things, and you can create a very, very obscure names with lots of consonants and no vowels in them, and you can say, this is how this is written in my language, and that is how it's pronounced. But if it doesn't connect with your audience, it just might fall short. So these are things that we will have to think about, so to speak. So I forgot to add a thank you slide at the end. So I thank you in person. So this is, it's just about 1 hour, I guess. And this is what I aimed for. I'm glad we did it in one take. So I will stop screen sharing. Is this how no, this is not how I stop screen sharing. This is how I stop screen sharing. Okay. So hopefully you have me back on the webcam now, and I have my earphones on this time. This is my natural state. So thank you for listening for this week's lecture. I will stop recording now, and then after that we can talk about the lecture freely, however we want. Where do I stop recording? There was a recording. Yes, here it is.